There is a serious problem at epidemic levels right now with our breathing that is causing so many other issues that we really need to get a hold of this, or we're never, ever going to be healthy.
Hello out there. What's up, peoples? Here we are, Switch for Good podcast, and we are so happy to be here. I'm happy to see you, Alexandra.
Hi, Dotsie. It's always a pleasure.
Oh, it's not, but okay. It is for me. I don't know if
It's
always
very
not
much for me.
So this is a long time coming, this episode, this guest. We're going to talk all about breathing today, how we don't currently probably breathe correctly. You may. I don't know that I do. You've gone a little bit deeper. I haven't really visited this subject since all my years as a professional athlete leading into Olympics. I haven't. So I'm very excited to dive deep. But before we go in and we introduce this incredible New York Times best-selling author of this book called Breath, a little bit about you being told when you were 12 years old in confirmation class that you were not breathing correctly.
Yeah, I know. It freaked me out.
Yeah.
It had to do with prayer, and that we were supposed to breathe. I was told I wasn't breathing properly, that I needed to breathe by inhaling, my stomach should go out, and when I exhaled, my stomach should go in. And I guess I wasn't doing that. It just really bothered me that something that I was supposed to be doing all the time, I was told not to.
Yeah,
I was doing wrong, and that's why this book so fascinated me, because breath has come up in my life, as it has with all of us when we think about it after we talk today. I know a lot of people are going to have stories of their own breathing or not breathing, or fear of not being able to breathe, etc. When I was 20, I was making out with, he was a guy I was dating a little bit, and he was a yoga instructor. And when we were making out, he was breathing. He was doing this breathing thing.
Okay.
No, I know. I had no idea. And I didn't ask him, what is it? What's going on? But we didn't actually go out for very long. Although he did introduce me to yoga, for which I am eternally grateful, because for the last 35 years, I have now been doing yoga. So even though I didn't really understand his breathing technique, so maybe our guest today will be able to explain to me if he got some kind of sexual heightening or something from breathing.
Did it change your experience of kissing to what you would have liked it to have been?
I remember I was thinking, what is he doing?
Right. That's all you could think about.
Sort of we were kissing, and I don't even remember exactly, but I just remember it took me out a little bit of my own thinking, am I breathing properly? Not am I kissing properly, but am I breathing properly?
Happening right now.
Oh my gosh. So what about you? You are an Olympic athlete. Did they ever talk to you about how to breathe properly, especially as a sprinter?
I'm a sprinter. I have a sprinter gene.
You have a sprinter gene.
You
had to go damn fast to win a silver in the Olympics and so many world championships.
So the very first time that I raced in Europe, I was still so new to the sport, like way too new, but I had made the U.S. national team, and it was my very first trip to Europe, and we had a French director.
This is track cycling, right?
No, this is road cycling.
Oh,
this is because I did that for 10, 11 years before I switched over to the track. So this is road cycling. So we're in it was the first stage in a stage race. And as some people who know road cycling, there's the stars, and then there's their domestiques. And I was definitely a domestique. Just even trying to stay with the pack for a half an hour was a challenge from the 5-hour race.
Your job was to help the stars get their food and
Right. But nobody needed food in the first 30 minutes, and that's all I could stay with the pack. So I was just dead weight basically in the beginning. But we had a French director. His name was Jean-Paul, and we had been racing for like 20 minutes, and we start up the first climb. And it's kind of steep, and so then the action starts to take place, like the first separations. And I'm like, rider 1 out of 100 that are getting dropped first. So as the cars start to move through the peloton, right, to stay with the leaders. So the cars are whizzing by me, and here comes Jean-Paul in the U.S. car, and he's like, Dotsie, you have to breathe. And I've never heard about anything about breathing, how to breathe, what it means to breathe correctly. I mean, this has just never even occurred to me, but I'm hyperventilating because I'm panicking because I'm not there to help the girls, right? I'm already getting dropped and we're 20, 30 minutes into the race. And so he stayed with me, bless him, for a couple of minutes and taught me what was my first lesson on deep belly breathing and getting it in from the depths. And, I'm breathing from my throat at that. So that was it was extraordinary. And then, later we can talk about some of the breathing techniques that I used on the line before I would, walk up the stairs to clip in for track cycling, because that sport, I struggled tremendous with nerves. And so I had to really adopt a very specific breathing routine for that. So it's just this whole subject is beyond fascinating.
It's great. And the book Breath that we're going to cover today talks about anxiety and breathing and how we can help our anxiety through our breathing and our performance in sports. She has a lot of great information about that and our health. So this
asthma and sleep apnea and which my dad has. So I want to go into that.
Let me introduce our guest today. Okay, our guest today is James Nestor. He is a journalist and has written for a lot of high-profile magazines. He's also a very prolific author. He most recently wrote Breath, The New Science of a Lost Art, which is now a national bestseller. It's going to be translated into 30 languages next year. James doesn't just sit behind a desk all day. He actually participates in the subject about which he's writing. In his for this book, he did his own studies on himself, which we'll go into. And he also wrote a book. Ian read it in his book club and loved it and he'd read it and he'd be like, Alexandra, read this about whales and how they have such good sense of direction. So anyway, in Deep, James went under the sea with free divers and he's won just so many awards for that book, and it's also been translated in a lot of languages. And then he wrote a book called Get High Now Without Drugs, and I'm curious what he did personally to research that book too. But we'll have to ask him and a lot more. James Nestor, welcome to Switch for Good podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So we want to start off with breathing. Dotsie and I both discussed how we had been told that we weren't breathing properly. Can you talk a little bit about right up front how we're not breathing properly? Because a lot of the audience might say, this show's not for me. I breathe just fine. I've been living for the last 40, 50, 60 years.
Well, a lot of people think that breathing is a binary thing. If we're doing it, that's good. We're alive. And if we're not, that's bad. We're dead, or we're unconscious, or something bad has happened to us. But it's really not. It's how we breathe determines so much of our health and, in some aspects, our happiness. I know that seems crazy, and it seemed crazy to me when I first went into this field and started talking to the experts. But the writing's on the wall, and the data is very clear. If you think that people aren't breathing properly nowadays, asthma, how many people have COPD? How many people have sleep apnea, snoring? I mean, I could go on down this list, and it just shows you that we've completely lost touch with the most simple and profound biological function. And because of that, we are now suffering from so many chronic diseases. They are linked to our inability to breathe properly.
How do you think we've lost the ability? Did we ever have it down?
Yeah, we had it down great, just like every other mammal, right? There's 5,400 other mammals, and they all seem to breathe just fine. But if you look at humans, we all have these diseases. So many of them are respiratory diseases that other animals don't have and that our ancestors didn't have. So this was the first question I tried to answer is, why are we breathing so improperly? Why do asthma rates continue to go up year after year after year, and allergies and chronic sinusitis and sleep apnea? And it turns out that so much of this is tied to this anatomical change that has occurred in our faces over the last 300 years. So if you were to look at an ancient skull, it would have perfectly straight teeth, this very forward-growing face, this huge jaw. Modern skulls, about 90% of us, I'm a great example, have crooked teeth. Our mouths have grown so small that they no longer have room for teeth to grow in straight, so they grow in crooked. And this means that we also have a smaller airway, smaller mouth, smaller airway, breathing problems. And no one's refuting any of the science. It's very clear. You can look up a zillion ancient skulls and you can see their faces. And then you could look at modern skulls and see what's happened. It's just there was so little awareness of it that really shocked me.
It doesn't make sense biologically that we would do something so bad for us. What are we doing wrong then that has caused our face to change so that we're not breathing? Or what came first? Our face changed and then we didn't breathe properly, or we weren't breathing properly so our face changed?
Life is always changing, is always evolving. So if you look at a skull from 1,000 or for several 100,000 years ago to one today, it's very different, but that change happens at a very slow pace. So animals are able to adopt to it and adapt. And we were just fine. Our ancestors were just fine. But the changes that happened in the last few hundred years happened so quickly and so suddenly that we haven't been able to adapt. And so that's why we're breathing so poorly. So the main culprit here is lack of chewing because of a highly processed diet of industrialized foods. So teeth can grow crooked within a single generation of eating industrialized foods. And we saw that in the 1800s when all of the processed flour and processed rice and baked goods and soft stuff and bottled stuff and canned stuff really started spreading throughout Europe. And then we saw it very quickly in the US as well. So again, there isn't too much controversy about this, even though this sounds like some crazy hypothesis. It's not. There's very clear science. But a lot of people haven't looked at how those changes have affected our ability to breathe. And that's what I really tried to dive into on this book.
It makes sense that if we were not practicing and using our muscular structure and our bone structure of our face by chewing, harder, denser foods, cruciferous vegetables and nuts and seeds that are harder, that it would just waste away. I mean, that's what the rest of our body does. That makes sense to me that our mouths would have become smaller over time, even just over the last 200 years from industrialized food.
Yeah, and that chewing stress starts in infancy. So you look at, there's been studies that have been done with this. Kids who have been breastfed, which takes a ton of chewing stress and helps to actually pull the face outward and flatten the upper palate to make for a bigger mouth, they will suffer from less snoring and sleep apnea later on in life because they have larger airways because they're using those muscles. Yeah. So bottle feeding is not the same. And feeding a kid, a bunch of soft mush for the first years of his or her life is not going to really increase that masticatory stress to build the skeleture and musculature to develop a proper mouth. And so, this is just rampant through our society. This was exactly what happened to me. And that's why I had braces and extractions and headgear, and everyone I knew had the same thing. So it's just the fact that we consider these things because they're so rampant to be totally normal now. Like it's normal to have braces. Well, our ancestors never had braces and they had perfectly straight teeth. So something has gone wrong here. And how that all relates to breathing is I've found to be a pretty fascinating area of research that not a lot of people had peered into before.
Mm-hmm. So tell us how we're breathing now and how you recommend we breathe.
So a lot of us have resistance in our airways. So you don't have to suffer from diagnosed snoring or sleep apnea or asthma to still be suffering from inadequate breathing. We breathe about 20,000 to 25,000 times a day. That's on the upper end. And if you're doing that just a little off, your body is going to suffer. It's just imagine taking 10,000 steps and having your ankle slightly off or a toe that hurts, how the rest of the body compensates and suffers from that. So this is something that, a lot of researchers have been studying for decades and decades, but it's mostly been locked in academic journals and not been able to really get out to the general public. So the first thing to do is to become aware of your breathing and to become aware that the vast majority of us are breathing inadequately. Then you can take various steps to improve that. And that's really what the book was about. I didn't want to dwell on this negative bummer stuff the whole time. I wanted to address the problem and say there is a serious problem at epidemic levels right now with our breathing that is causing so many other issues that we really need to get a hold of this, or we're never, ever going to be healthy.
Tell us how we're breathing incorrectly, though. I mean, my understanding is that we don't breathe enough through our nose, and we're breathing a lot through our mouth. Is one of them. You bring up many different ways that we don't breathe correctly, but that seems to be a big one.
We're breathing too much. We're breathing too often. We're breathing through our mouths. Our breathing is becoming completely stressed and reflecting our mental state, which creates this sort of closed circuit of stress in our bodies. Oftentimes, people can hold their breath when they're extremely stressed at work. It's called email apnea, which is extremely injurious. So there's many different ways that we are breathing improperly. We have a lot of resistance in our airways because of that too small of a mouth as well. Mm-hmm. So the way to get around that is to take it sequentially. That's a lot. That's a real mouthful, right? No pun intended. To get your head around, but it's to take it step by step, and that starts with breathing through your nose and breathing through your nose all the time. The nose and the mouth are two very different passageways for air to filter through, and our body is able to digest this air in very different ways. So nasal breathing is far superior.
Can you help us understand physiologically what was happening and changing in my body when Jean-Paul stopped next to me for a couple moments in the car and got me deep belly breathing? I know, from your book that, there's different hormones, there's different chemical releases. There's a lot of things happening biologically, physiologically, when you start breathing correctly. What were the changes that were happening in my body to calm me down? And obviously I was able to then bring in more oxygen to my working muscles and get back up with the leaders of the race.
So this is something that happens so often, and it doesn't matter if you're sitting in front of a desk answering email, or if you're out running, or if you're out competing, is we start to lose focus of our breathing. So I wasn't there. I don't know exactly what training he was having you do. I don't know if he was having you breathe more because you were holding your breath, or he was having you breathe less. But I know the end result of that was he was getting you to breathe in line with your metabolic needs. And this can be a tricky thing to suss out, but if we overbreathe, we are causing our bodies all this extra stress to work extra hard to get less air. And this is so counterintuitive. It took me months to get my head around this. But when we breathe into our chests here and we take just a ton of short breaths, what we're doing is we're just taking air into our airways and other passages that do not participate in gas exchange. So only the lungs can absorb oxygen. And when you breathe that quickly, shallowly, you're just taking air into your throat, into your mouth, into the bronchus up here, none of which participates in gas exchange. So you're literally taking that breath in to push it back out, and you're not using any of that breath. So this causes the heart to speed up because you're stimulating the sympathetic side of your nervous system. And it causes you to work so much harder just to get a breath of air. If you are breathing more deeply, you can take fewer breaths and get way more oxygen. So what he was having you do, I believe, even though, as I said, I wasn't there, is having you take these deep breaths to get more oxygen, to allow more oxygen to get into your bloodstream to deliver all of that O2 to your hungry cells. And this is something, again, that a lot of athletes aren't paying attention to, which is crazy because the whole point of being an athlete is to work at peak efficiency so you can go further and faster than your opponent. And breathing is what's going to be able to allow you to do that.
You have, just to stay on with the athlete theme, you have in your book a lot about a man named Carl Stow. And he improved the lives of a variety of people who were really sick with emphysema. he helped singers, and he helped Olympic runners. Can you talk a little bit about him and how he changed, certainly how some coaches viewed how important breath was, and also doctors?
Yeah, this was an extraordinary story. I had never heard of this guy, and I had spent, a year and a half really digging deep into breathing research. And then by happenstance, I stumbled upon his name. A friend referred me to his book, which has been out of print since 1971. It's called Dr. Breath. And Carl Stow was a vocal teacher. He was a choral conductor. And he found that a lot of his singers in the chorus didn't have a lot of resonance, and they had to keep gasping for air just every time they were singing. So he taught them to breathe more deeply in this very fluid way to develop their diaphragms. The diaphragm is this huge muscle that sits underneath the lungs that sinks down when we take a breath in and then floats back up when we exhale. So by just increasing this diaphragmatic movement, he was able to help singers with their tone, with their resonance, hold longer notes. And he became so famous that the Met Opera brought him in to try to train their opera singers who already knew how to sing pretty well. And here's this guy from, down in New Jersey who was teaching courses how to do this. So after doing this for years and years, the pulmonologists at VA hospitals on the East Coast, this was in the 50s, heard about him and said, hey, maybe you know something about breathing that we don't. And they had just hundreds and hundreds of emphysema patients. They had no idea what to do with these people. They put a little oxygen cannula up to their noses and shot them up with antibiotics and left them in a corner to die. That's literally how they dealt with these people. So he went in, this is a guy who isn't a doctor, who's a choral teacher, and found a way of developing their diaphragms because they had lost all ability to move their diaphragms. If you've seen an emphysemic breathe, they use all these other muscles in their necks and chests just to get a breath in because they've lost diaphragmatic movement. The only thing he did is he would massage their chests and teach them how to engage that diaphragm. And these people left for dead, walked out of the hospital, and they did this for 10 years. So the story's getting a little long. Hopefully it's not boring you.
No, it's not. My dad actually had emphysema. And just so our audience understands, emphysema, and correct me if I'm wrong, James, is when the smaller capillaries are unable to take in oxygen. So that's why emphysemics breathe so shallowly. And is that correct?
Yes, it's the bronchioles attached to the alveoli. For some reason, they disconnect and because of disease. So that oxygen is no longer able to get into the alveoli, which then would send it into the bloodstream into red blood cells. So that's exactly right. So emphysema is irreversible. The damage that's caused by emphysema, you can't grow new bronchioles or alveoli or any of those connections. But what you can do is engage the rest of the lungs, which are still not diseased, which can still work perfectly well. But for some reason, the doctors weren't considering this. They were just saying, this lung tissue is permanently damaged. What can we do? Well, our lungs can hold 6 liters of air. Why not engage the lower lobes of the lungs? And that's exactly what Carl Stow went in and did for a decade. And he was able to do what nobody was able to do. And he, according to the doctors there, what he was doing was medically impossible. And yet the x-rays didn't lie and the patients didn't lie. And they kept walking out of the hospital.
And then he went on to Yale running team and then to train Olympians.
Yeah, so this guy's life just got weirder and weirder. Well, I guess not weird, but he kept expanding out. So the Yale running team and the U.S. Olympic team heard that there's this guy who's rehabilitating emphysemics in a way that no one else was able to do it. Maybe he can help the runners. And this was right before the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City at an elevation of about 6,500 feet. So he worked with the Yale team, and then he went to Lake Tahoe and worked with the Olympic team. And within a couple weeks, these guys were breaking personal best records. They were running faster than they'd ever run. And then they went down to Mexico City and completely destroyed everybody. It's the greatest track performance, I believe, ever in Olympic history, and certainly for any U.S. team. And they did not use oxygen before or after the race. They were the only team not to do that. They said, we don't need to. We know how to breathe.
But that seems to have been lost. Dotsie, have you ever heard of a breathing expert going to the Olympic Training Center?
No, not a breathing expert, but I think there's a fair amount of sports psychologists and psychiatrists who have gotten the memo on how anxious athletes are before, because mine was, I wouldn't call her a breathing expert, but then maybe I could because she fixed me to be able to get on the bike, because I had struggled for so many nerves and anxiety in track cycling, because it's such a fishbowl type of event. So, yeah, but I don't think she would call herself, necessarily like a breathing. But I'm wondering, this is what is really fascinating to be about it. Like, again, physiologically, what's happening. You said in the book that our bodies need more air, but you specifically said, everyone would think, oh, we need more oxygen, but you said it's carbon dioxide. Will you explain that?
You need a balance of those two things. So for an emphysemic or someone at altitude, they absolutely need oxygen. There are huge benefits from inhaling oxygen because they are low in O2, and they can see that from a pulse oximeter. For a healthy person at around sea level, inhaling oxygen is going to do nothing for you. And so send that memo to the oxygen bars. This is something I heard from my father-in-law, who's a pulmonologist, years ago. I was like, what are you talking about? Then the deeper I got into this world, I heard the same thing. Because we already have healthy levels of oxygen in our bloodstream. If you're up at 96, 97%, huffing oxygen in a bar isn't going to do a thing for you. But so many of us are breathing too much, and we have low levels of carbon dioxide. And if we have low levels of carbon dioxide, oxygen has a hard time of disassociating from red blood cells into our hungry cells. The biochemistry here is wildly complicated, but I'll just suffice to say that the short version is our bodies have to find a way of compensating if we have low CO2, which will eventually wear us down. By having a proper balance of CO2 and oxygen, you are going to be able to get oxygen so much easier, which is why right now, if we were to take 20 big breaths, our heads you're going to start to feel a little lightheaded. You might feel some like tingling in your fingers and toes. That's not from an increase of oxygen. It's from a decrease of circulation. Yeah. So by taking slower breaths and breathing in line with your metabolic needs, you will increase circulation and you will increase the ease at which your body can disassociate oxygen from your red blood cells. Again, it's technical, but that's what it equals.
No, but you did. That makes sense now to me.
Okay. Does that mean that, because I'm interested in breath, as Dotsie, as you know, I've been taping my mouth at night so I can breathe through my nose, because I was a mouth breather, and so I'm training myself. I still breathe through. When I work out, I need to breathe more through my nose. I still have a tendency to open my mouth and do that. So I'm working on it, but I noticed that I breathe twice as slow as Ian, my husband. And
at night, not when you're activity, not when you're running around.
No, it's mostly just when we're spooning and we try and breathe in sync. Right. I have to. He breathes too fast for me, and so I breathe every second of his. Still in sync. It's just slower. Somehow it feels in sync. But James, you talk about the fact that, tell me if I'm wrong, is that we need to exhale more, take more time exhaling. Is because that's where the carbon, is that right? Did I read that right in your book?
Well, it depends on what you want to accomplish.
About the carbon dioxide.
Sure. So by taking more time to exhale and by taking these slower breaths and always breathing through the nose, we're going to allow our body not to offload too much CO2. If you take a breath through your nose right now, you're going to feel this resistance, right? So there's a vacuum when the air comes in and there's positive pressure when it comes out. That pressure and that extra time allows the lungs to absorb more oxygen. So if you breathe through the mouth, there's no resistance. So people who are just huffing and puffing away. And when gyms were open, I used to see this all the time. People on ellipticals and just with their mouths open and thinking they're getting more oxygen. But the reason why they still feel so out of breath is because they're not. They're just breathing into their chest right there, and their bodies are deficient in oxygen because they're offloading so much of that CO2.
You
It's
actually
like you want to have resistance, and that's the way to train so many things in life, right? Is to create that resistance. That makes sense.
It's natural resistance. This is the pathway through which we should be breathing. Look at a cheetah running at 60 miles per hour hunting prey. It's breathing through its nose. We're the only animal that has become obligate mouth breathers, except for like some bulldogs and pugs who have been bred to have these faces like ours that are completely flat and who breathe like I mean, they're just like humans. Beyond them, every other animal is breathing through its nose.
Tell us about the experiment that you did on yourself through Stanford with a breathing pal from over the pond, where you spent 10 days mouth breathing and 10 days nose breathing, and you recorded all your vitals and how you felt.
This was never my intention to be part of this book and to be testing stuff on myself. And it just got pretty strange once I started getting deeper into this world and found that there were so many gaps in our understanding of breathing. And one of those was, we know that mouth breathing is bad for the body. Okay, we know that nasal breathing is better. And I had learned all this from the chief of rhinology research at Stanford, a real leader in the field named Dr. Jayakar Nayak. But nobody knew how quickly the damage from mouth breathing would really come on. So is it a year? Is it 6 months? No one knew. And I asked Nayak, I said, well, why hasn't someone tested this? And he thought it would be unethical because he knew of all the damage that it can cause. I said, well, what if I volunteer? Then it's not unethical for you because I'm volunteering, and I'll try to find someone else. And he agreed to it. So he gave so much time from his lab to do this. We had to pay for the study, which at Stanford was not super cheap because he had no money allocated for it. But we knew it wasn't going to be pleasant. That first 10 days of just mouth breathing, we had silicone up our noses. If that sounds like it sucked, it's because it totally did. But then again, this is 25 to 50% of the population. This is how they're living all the time. So it wasn't like a super size me study. We were just placing ourselves into a position that so much of the population already knew, but we were collecting data. And within a couple hours, my blood pressure was as high as I've ever seen it in my life. It went up about 15 to 20 points. A couple hours after that, I went to sleep. And for the first time that I'm aware of, I started snoring. I snored that first night, an hour and a half. I got sleep apnea. 4 days later, I was snoring for 4 hours throughout the night. My sleep apnea was getting way worse. The other poor subject, this wonderful Swedish guy, who came over to San Francisco for a month to plug his nose up with the Stanford study because he's a breathing therapist. He wanted to know. He suffered so much worse than me to really serious sleep apnea. I mean, our health went to hell within a number of days, not a number of years, just by changing the pathway through which we breathe.
And then what happened when you unplugged your nose and breathe through your unplug your nose and breathe through your nose for another 10 days.
Yeah.
Everything changed. My blood pressure within a couple hours went down about 15 points. And blood pressure fluctuates throughout the day, right? It's higher in the afternoon than it is in the morning and all that. But I thought, oh, that's interesting. That night, I snored, I think, for about 23 minutes, 24 minutes. So down from 4 hours. Couple nights later, I was snoring 0 minutes. I had zero sleep apnea. My blood pressure was down an average of about 15 points. Anders Olsen, the breathing therapist, other subject in the study, went from about 4 hours of snoring, severe sleep apnea, to zero on both those things. So it was a complete transformation. And, we were laughing about the study at the beginning, but towards the end of it, it started making me really sad that so many people are not aware that just the pathway through which they're breathing is causing their bodies such undue stress, neurological problems, metabolic problems, and nobody's talking about this. And I just thought that that was absolutely bizarre and kind of criminal in some ways, because breathing is something that anyone can do at any time, anywhere. And so it should be really the first thing that people are taught to do. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying anything bad about Western medicine. I wouldn't be alive without Western medicine. I'm a huge fan of Western medicine. There's 2 doctors in the family. I talk with them all the time. They're my heroes. But the foundation of health needs to consider, like, not just food or exercise. Breathing has to be a part of that. And that's something I saw firsthand with that Stanford study.
Mm-hmm. How does each nostril affect us? Are they different? Are they almost always different in each person? And can you breathe through one and not the other? And then vice versa? And does that help us?
Sure. So this was another pretty bizarre thing I stumbled upon, and I heard about this from Stanford as well. I had a hard time believing it, and then I went a little deeper into the research and found it's true. So I'm sure if you've done yoga before, you've done alternate nostril breathing. Almost every yoga class does that. Mm-hmm. It turns out that our bodies automatically do alternate nostril breathing without any intervention from us. And that's because our nasal passages are coated in erectile tissue. It's the same erectile tissue as you know where, and it engorges with blood and becomes inflamed just like the other erectile tissue you know where. So throughout the day, our bodies will open up one nostril for about 30 minutes to 3 or 4 hours, and then gently close that nostril to open up the other nostril. So why would we develop this ability? And it turns out that breathing from one nostril to the other can affect how our brains work. It can affect how our bodies work. It affects circulation, heartbeat, and so many other things. So the fact that our bodies are doing this throughout the day, likely to help balance themselves as we get stressed, as we get sleepy, as we get energized, to me, I think is just fascinating. You don't get any of those benefits through the mouth.
Hey, friends and listeners of the Switch for Good podcast. Yep, that's you. I have some really exciting news. Dotsie and I have started a Switch for Good podcast Facebook group. We created it so we can build a community of fans that will help us improve the show and deliver on the topics that you want to learn more about. So we want to hear what your favorite content is, what you want more of, and what you want less of. And if you like the length of the show, Dotsie and I are always talking about the length of the show, right, Dotsie?
Yes.
We want to tailor our show around the needs and desires of our incredible listeners, almost 500,000 of you. And it's really simple to join. Just go to our Switch for Good Facebook page. That's Switch, the number 4, and then Good. And then click on groups. And there we are, the Switch for Good podcast chat. You can post directly in the group, share ideas, talk to other listeners, and connect with like-minded folks. So go, run, join our Facebook group and tell us what you want.
Asthma. You have some interesting, inspiring stories of people who suffered from asthma. Talk to us about some of the stories that you detail in your book about people who changed their breathing and helped their asthma.
So I luckily have not had asthma. It seems like everyone else I knew had asthma. But what these people are told and what they understand is once you have asthma, it's an incurable condition, right? It's you can blunt the symptoms of asthma, but you can't do anything to cure the core problem of it. And that's still widely acknowledged as being the fact behind asthma. But I started finding this research, which was very interesting. About 70 years ago, this Russian cardiologist found that by training people to do these exercises in which they breathe less, he could increase their carbon dioxide levels, which carbon dioxide is this wonderful vasodilator. It increases circulation, and he could blunt so many symptoms of asthma. So he developed this whole protocol of doing this, like thousands. He built a laboratory, thousands of people did this. And around the 1960s, a hospital in England called the Papworth, they developed something called the Papworth method, which did the same thing. It taught asthmatics to breathe more slowly, almost like weight training. It would teach them these exercises to breathe extremely slow, sometimes hold their breath. So then when they weren't doing these exercises, they would unconsciously breathe more slowly. Because we know asthmatics, especially as a population breathe way too much, and they tend to breathe through their mouths. And that can exacerbate their asthma and cause them to have attacks. What happens with an asthmatic feels like they're holding their breath, and that causes an attack. So instead, by having them breathe very slow and calm themselves down, it can have a tremendous effect on asthma. And so many of these people, I've talked to dozens of them, and various researchers have done studies in this. Just by taking control of their breathing, some of these people have been able to get rid of their bronchodilators, to no longer take steroids, and to no longer suffer from the symptoms of asthma. I want to be clear, this is not telling any asthmatic to ditch your medications. Stay on those medications. Talk to your doctor. But also explore some of the breathing interventions that so many people have used with asthma to really improve their circumstances.
What I'm hearing you say then too is that our nose, that resistance that you were talking about, has multiple positive purposes and effects, because it could also is probably also a filtration system to some degree, because you have no filtration at all when you breathe in your mouth. So whatever's, blooming outside, if people say they have, just seasonal allergies or seasonal asthmatic responses, is that part of it? Is it we have such a great filtration system through our nostrils?
The density of your nasal hairs alone has been linked to the onset of asthma. So people with less nasal hairs can be more apt to have asthma. So that alone has been found. There's a correlation there. I'm going to now invite my friend. He hangs out over by the wall, but you can see, I'll invite him on just for a second. This is a cross section for anyone listening to this, a cross section of a human skull. And you can see the nasal passages here. You are forcing air through this gauntlet of passages where that air is moistened, it's humidified, it's filtered, it's pressurized, on and on and on. So that by the time it gets down to the lungs, it's conditioned. Through the mouth, zero. Air just comes in and goes directly to the lungs. And when you're breathing through the mouth, you can think of the lungs as an external organ, because they're exposed to everything in your environment, which nowadays is viruses, allergens, pollutants. This is our first line of defense, the nose.
I'm going to tell my dad to get rid of his nose hair trimmer, because he loves those little things. We've stocking stuffer. We'll use.
Well, he can shorten them, but he just can't densify
Well,
them.
I think he digs up in there. And how? So
okay.
Yeah.
That sounds like a
because he has sleep apnea.
Thing.
But not after he reads this book and listens to this podcast. I've got some work to do.
Also, nitric oxide, is that something that gets triggered when we breathe through our nose and helps us, our mood and our well-being?
You have studied up. Absolutely.
I've read your book.
So, nitric oxide, like in beets, right? Same nitric oxide that helps with our endurance.
I had only mentioned this briefly in the book because I couldn't go down into the nitric oxide hole too deeply. But since the book has come out, I've seen so much science on this. And the man who won the Nobel Prize for his work in nitric oxide, Louis Ignarro, had found that nitric oxide alone, when it's exposed to COVID, it can help mammalian cells live so much longer. So it's no coincidence there are 11 clinical trials going on right now of giving people with COVID nitric oxide, because it not only helps to battle viruses, it's a vasodilator, and it helps to open up all of those passageways so that blood can get in there. And it's no coincidence that Viagra and other sexual performance drugs, I guess that's erectile dysfunction drugs, I don't know, whatever you want to call them, guess what they do? They stimulate the release of nitric oxide. So breathing through the nose will increase your nitric oxide 6 times more than breathing through the mouth, and humming will increase that 15-fold. So those are 2 quick little tricks that you can do to increase your nitric oxide.
Oh, and humming and breathing through your nose at the same time. We'll do it.
Humming. And nitric oxide, people think like, oh, I'm just going to hum for a little bit and store up for the rest of the day. It lasts from about 2 to 6 seconds. So you have to constantly be creating this to have the advantages of it. And that's what the nose does. If you're breathing through the nose all the time, you're going to have much more nitric oxide.
In the Game Changers film, there's this scene where they talk about a study on nitric oxide in beet, so that if you drink a cup of beet juice, and I'm sorry, I've got to go back and look. I don't know if it's 8 ounces or 10 or 12, but whatever cup of beet juice, it increases your endurance output by 12%.
Yeah.
Which is a lot.
Right.
It's
right?
crazy,
You're just looking...
crazy numbers. Yeah. There's other foods that I think help release that, but beets are number one.
Yeah.
When I was asking about asthma, I also wanted to touch on anxiety, because Dotsy's brought it up a couple times, and a lot of people nowadays seem to have anxiety. Is there a way to breathe that can maybe through our nostrils, because you talked about the different parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems, that might help somebody who might have an anxious moment and want to calm down?
So the left nostril, an inhale through the left nostril is associated with a cooling parasympathetic effect. So we know that the heart rate will lower when you're breathing through the left nostril, and you will get more activity in the right side, creative side of your brain. They've done EEG studies to prove this. So anyone can do that at any time. You can breathe in through your left nostril, exhale through your right. And there's a zillion different combinations to do this. I'm not a breathing therapist. I don't lead people through these practices. There's other people much more qualified to do that. But breathing in through your right nostril, inhaling through that channel will stimulate the body, increase your heart rate, increase blood pressure. So that's one you can use. But I think the best advice for anxiety and to calm yourself down is to breathe slowly and to breathe at a steady pace of about 5 to 6 second inhale, 5 to 6 second exhale. If you're a little off from that time, that's fine. The point of this is to chill you out and not get stressed. Some people have written me and said, what if I'm a half a second off? I said, oh no. The point is just to relax and go with it. If you really want to become relaxed, you can extend the exhales. So every time we inhale, and you can feel this by placing your hand over your heart. Let's inhale to a count of about 4. So 3, 4, and then exhale to about 8 if that's comfortable for you. Keep breathing at that pattern. You're going to feel when you exhale, your heart rate's going to slow down. When you inhale, your heart rate's going to speed up, because an inhalation is associated with a sympathetic or a energetic response. So that's known as the fight or flight part of the nervous system. And an exhale is associated with a parasympathetic rest and relaxation response, which is exactly why your heart rate increases when you inhale, while it decreases when you exhale. So by extending those exhales, maybe breathe in to 4, exhale to 6. That's a common one people use. You can actually hack into your nervous system and calm your body down and send messages to your brain to relax. We know that how you breathe affects how you think. It affects areas of the brain.
Post-Olympics, I was working with a company that makes pulse oximeters, and we oxygen saturation, pulse rate, and then they ended up adding respiration rate. And so I was working with, athletes that were headed to the next Olympic Games on kind of the breathing system that I used. And because athletes tend to be kind of competitive, they would have their set values that they aim to see, and they would, know their own body, because everybody's are different. Even oxygen saturation, right? Like you may normally just sit around 96, but other people sit, around 98. And so then they would almost compete with themselves prior to competition to get them in their most, zen and ready state, and have that pulse oximeter on. And my dearest friend from high school has severe anxiety and was having to take medication. And so when I was working with this company, I thought, you know what, I'm just going to send her one. She was having such severe anxiety that she couldn't drive. She couldn't take her kids to school. I mean, she would pull over on the side of the road and she'd have to call her husband to come pick her up. So she got this device and learned her numbers, and it really started to unravel her out of anxiety. And it was the breathing, but it just kind of gave her something to give her the confidence, like, okay, now I can drive again. Because she'd still have to pull over. She'd do the breathing routines and watch her numbers, and then go, okay, I'm safe now, and be able to get back out.
Good.
Go get her kids.
I've heard
powerful.
so many of these stories, and Dr. Richard Brown at Columbia has used breathing for people with depression, anorexia, anxiety, I mean, you name it. And he's a top psychiatrist and has found incredible benefits from just teaching people how to breathe properly. And it's bizarre to me that you go to your doctor, and again, I'm not pointing at any doctors. They're doing the best they can, seeing 20 patients in an hour.
Yeah.
But you're asked about hypertension, headaches, sleep, anxiety, all that. But no one ever talks to you about how you're breathing. And how you're breathing is the quickest and most effective way of getting a hold of so many of those chronic issues. I'm not saying it's a panacea, it's going to cure everything, but it is really a great foundation upon which you can build the rest of your protocol to get better.
And if you don't breathe properly, you can't often get healthy enough to.
Yeah, and it's free.
And
It's like
no
the
drugs.
most affordable. Yeah.
You talk about breath restriction and hypoventilation training. I want to talk about that in two contexts. One, the runner Emil Zapatek, and two, in autoerotic asphyxiation or erotic asphyxiation, which is also a type of breath restriction. You don't cover that in your book, and I was curious as to why, actually, because it's been in the news when somebody famous dies from autoerotic asphyxiation, etc. But let's go to Emil first, and then you can go to autoerotic asphyxiation.
Yeah, I'll tackle that first one, and hopefully we'll run out of time. I won't be able to talk about the other one, but just joking. Various athletes have used is hypoventilation, under breathing, and a lot of people think, why would I want to under breathe? And again, it's like a weight training device in which you can tolerate more CO2, and by tolerating more CO2, you can more easily offload that oxygen. You can utilize that oxygen better. And if you continue to use these under breathing exercises while you're working out, they can actually have the effect of altitude training. So what's the benefit of altitude training? A lot of people go up to altitudes above 7,000, 8,000 feet to build blood, right? You release more EPO. EPO releases more blood. Having more red blood cells allows you to carry more oxygen. So we can do this at sea level through these breath hold training or breath resistant training systems. And Zapatek, Czech runner, he was called the greatest runner of all time by Runner's World. Here's this guy who's working in a shoe factory, never ran a race in his life. The management said, hey, you need to run this race. He ended up coming in second out of 100 people. He said, maybe, I could be a runner instead of working in a shoe factory. He went on to win various gold medals, become one of the greatest runners in history. And I think it was the 1952 Olympics. He had never ran a marathon before, and he decided, because he had already won 2 gold medals in sprints, he's like, I'm going to try to do this, won a gold. So his training method was to do this hypoventilation, this under breathing. And it has since been used in the Montreal swim team, 1976 Olympics, and they destroyed everybody, won more golds than anyone else. And now it's being utilized not only for athletes, but for people with cardiac problems. It allows us to lose more weight more quickly. I know that seems crazy, but if your cells have more access to more oxygen, you need oxygen to burn fat. And we release, out of every 10 pounds of weight we lose, 10 pounds of fat we lose, 8.5 pounds comes through the lungs. We exhale it. So all of this is tied to breathing and efficiency of breathing. I'm not saying people should not go out there and try to hold your breath. Don't do any of the stuff near water, but find a breathing coach who can help you with this hypoventilation training and check out the science. There's hundreds of studies, and this stuff is really starting to explode. They're showing that it can be even effective for people with autoimmune problems.
To breathing and sex, and Dotsie and I don't shy away. We had an entire show on the penis, and so don't worry about. We're pretty straightforward here. And I just I was curious actually why you didn't mention it in your book, because it never came up, because I find personally that my breathing and sexual arousal is closely tied, and I had to learn it. And also we know, and don't do this at home either, this is a very dangerous thing. It's not something I know a lot about, but that if you restrict your breath, you have a heightened orgasm. So talk to me about any research that might have come up that you chose not to put in the book about breathing and sex.
So I had mentioned the parasympathetic response, the sympathetic response, right? So when we get sexually excited, we have to be in a parasympathetic response. So that's one of the reasons why if you're extremely angry or after a car accident, the machinery is not going to work very well because you're in that sympathetic, you're in that stressful state. So this sympathetic response, this is why these slow, deep, whispered breaths are very sexy to people, because it stimulates that parasympathetic relaxation response. But orgasms are a sympathetic response. So it's likely no coincidence that as you reach that crisis, your breathing starts speeding up, right? Because when you start speeding up your breathing, you're going to stimulate more of that sympathetic response, which will lead to that orgasm. I did not at all look into autoerotic asphyxiation. So I wasn't cutting anything from the book. I just, that was not something, maybe in the next edition. I do not know why someone would have a greater response to an orgasm that way. I do know that breathing techniques like the Wim Hof method you might have heard of, Tumo, Sudarshan Kriya, all of these do the same thing. They have you breathe very fast and then not breathe at all and hold your breath. And I can say from my own experience and the experience of hundreds of thousands of other people, you get extremely, for lack of a better term, high. And it's this ecstatic response in your body after a few rounds of this. Major dopamine release. It feels so rewarding. And that's why people keep coming back to it. So I assume there's probably some link of that dopamine release in addition to the release during an orgasm, but not my area of expertise.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. And also now we know why Marilyn Monroe talked like this.
I wanted to mention something about your yoga boyfriend.
Oh, yeah.
I think we won't wade too deeply into these waters, but he was probably getting himself in the mood by breathing these very slow and low breaths.
I guess I wasn't doing it for him. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, or you were, and he was ready to go to the next step, and you didn't take him there.
I think it was the latter of those two things. Maybe he before had gotten too excited at certain moments, and he was controlling himself. I don't know, but it sounds like he was well versed in the ways of the parasympathetic nervous system and sexual function. So good for him.
I think so. I should have talked to him about it. I could have learned a lot at age 20. Speaking of getting high, you wrote a book called Get High Now Without Drugs, where you discuss 175 ways to alter perception and consciousness without drugs or alcohol, which sounds fascinating. Dotsie and I know about some of them, like exercise and eating really well, falling in love,
sex,
but wondering if you could share a couple with us and if you did any self-experimentation there.
Yeah, it's funny that book, this was right when I was starting off, and I thought it would be a good idea to put out this book, and now it has just haunted me my whole life.
Aww.
But I'm going to give you a little background on this book.
Why has it haunted you? It's great.
I'm dying to go get it.
Yeah.
Because people thought it was about taking drugs because they don't mention the subtitle, and they think I'm some crazy
not
druggie.
Cool. Yeah.
So the quick nutshell backstory is my uncle was like a playboy of the old school Hollywood mansion, house on the hill by the Hollywood sign. And he passed away, and he had all of these notes on like weirdo meditation, some breathing stuff, not too much breathing stuff, other ways of expanding your consciousness without drugs. So that's where that book comes from. I had all these notes. I thought they were a crack up. I brought them up to my house in San Francisco, and a friend who was in publishing was like, you got to put a book out on this. So I spent 3 months putting that together. But that's the backstory of the book. But, a lot of what that book was a way of introducing science in a humorous way to get us to understand our bodies a little more and to understand how they work. And a lot of it was based on, not only dopamine, but serotonin release, how to do this, and tied to a lot of ancient ways of doing this. There's various herbs and stuff, but there's also some breathing stuff, some exercise stuff, runner's high, and trying to explain that from a scientific way. Mm-hmm. I did not name the book that. I hated that title. My editor won, and it's harangued me ever since. So,
well, I think it's a good title, but you're right, it can be misleading unless you have the subtitle, which is Without Drugs. Yeah. So, thank you.
What are a couple of, as the journey writing this book, and then when it came out, I can only imagine how many thousands and hundreds of thousands of people it has helped. Do you have a favorite story or two from people that have either written you or have come to a book signing? It said, this has changed my life, and here's how.
Yeah, I think one of the ones that impacted me the most, and I'm so lucky, and this is the best part of writing books, is to get these letters of people who have been really transformed by some of the research in there. And this isn't my research. I'm a reporter. So the thanks really needs to go to these experts who have worked for 30, 40 years in these institutions, and no one's been listening to them. So it's my pleasure to get their work out into the world. But I just received a letter last week of a lady whose kid was getting sicker and sicker, having trouble in school, having trouble breathing, couldn't sleep at night, big dark circles under her eyes. They were getting extremely worried. They had done 12 different tests, fMRIs, you name it. Various x-rays, blood work, allergies. No one knew what to do. They said, oh, your daughter's fine. She was watching her daughter just slip away into chronic illness. She figured out how to breathe. She got a breathing therapist. She figured out proper oral posture, which is placing the tongue on the roof of the mouth, breathing through the nose all the time, and all of her daughter's problems went away. ADHD went away. Nervousness went away. Anxiety went away. In a measured way. It's not just subjective. She looks completely different now. So stories like this that I think are so touching, but there's a part of me that is a little infuriated that, of the 12 different experts this woman went to with her daughter, no one was looking at her breathing. Yeah. And it's such a simple thing that it took them months and months and months of runaround to find that. So, that's the one thing that I really want to get the message out. And, the books, that's the whole story of the why, what, and where. But people can adopt simple breathing habits anywhere at any time. And you can really show some huge health benefits. And that's what the science is showing now. And the more this word gets out, the more I think we can all really benefit from it.
We sure can. And thank you so much. Story. Yeah, for your book's going to help a lot of people. And this interview will also help a lot of people. So we really appreciate you being on the podcast, James. So everybody get the book, Breath, The New Science of a Lost Art. I also recommend Deep. And if you want to know how to get high now without drugs, look for that book too. And we're looking forward to your next book, James. Do you have anything in the works, or I'm sure you're probably pretty concentrated on this one?
Yeah, it's been a little crazy last few months. I do have an idea, but the concept of going back into my writer shed for 2 years and writing it makes me a little queasy. So I'm just going to kind of get the word out about breathing for a little while and see where that takes me.
I hear you.
Well, we're glad you're doing that. Thanks you so much,
James.
Thanks a lot for having me.